March 11th, 1943. Royal Air Force Station, Boscombe Down, England. The rain came down sideways, hammering the tarmac in gray sheets. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford, 28 years old, wiped his goggles with an oil-stained rag and stared at the odd-looking machine in front of him. It wasn't supposed to fly. Even the mechanics had called it stupid. 2 engines bolted side by side on one wing frame, turning opposite directions like spinning saws. The thing looked unbalanced, heavy on its own ambition. Langford's commanding officer had said it plainly the night before. "You will not take that prototype airborne again without written authorization." Yet here he was, at dawn, walking toward the cockpit with a flight log tucked under his arm that nobody had signed. The experimental aircraft, unofficially dubbed Project Gemini, was meant to test counter-rotating propellers for the new Mosquito line. On paper, the theory was elegant. 2 propellers spinning opposite directions would cancel torque and increase climb rate. In practice, the first test flight had nearly killed Langford when the right engine cut out mid-turn and the plane rolled like a wounded bird. He had spent the last 48 hours in the hangar, sleeves rolled up, rerouting oil lines with copper tubing scavenged from a wrecked Wellington bomber, sealing joints with melted chewing gum and hope. He believed he could fix what the engineers on the ground said could not be fixed. A crew chief shouted over the wind, "Sir, Air Ministry says the program's on hold." Langford pretended not to hear. He was already climbing the ladder, boots slick with rain. Inside the cockpit, the world smelled of fuel and electricity. He ran a quick check, magnetos, mixture, trim tabs, each switch flipping with the metallic finality of a man choosing defiance over obedience. Before we continue, if you're interested in the untold practical stories of World War II that nobody teaches, hit subscribe. These stories changed warfare but never made it into official histories. At 6:14 hours, the twin props roared to life, spinning in opposite fury. The sound was uneven at first, like 2 engines arguing about physics itself. Langford eased the throttle forward. The aircraft shuddered, lifted its nose, then impossibly steadied. Through the side window, ground crew scattered for cover. He was airborne, unauthorized, again. The altimeter climbed past 1,000 feet, 2,000, then 3,000, 500. The air smoothed. For the first time, the twin-prop prototype flew straight. Langford grinned behind his oxygen mask. The vibration that had nearly torn the plane apart 2 days earlier was gone. The counter-rotation worked. He could feel it, the airframe finally balanced, every mechanical motion singing in harmony instead of fighting itself. Static crackled through the radio. "Gemini 1, this is Tower. You are ordered to return immediately. Repeat, return immediately." Langford switched the channel off. At 4,000 feet, the cloud layer broke open. The morning light poured through in gold streaks, glinting off the wet wings. He leveled out, throttled forward, and the airspeed indicator climbed past 340 miles per hour. Then he saw them, 5 black dots slicing through the northern haze, closing fast. German reconnaissance Messerschmitt Bf 110 seconds, flying the long patrol over the Channel Gap. They hadn't expected company. Neither had he. Langford's plane carried no guns, only instruments, but reflex moved faster than reason. He nosed down, engines screaming in opposite pitch. The counter-rotating props bit the air like claws. The prototype dived faster than a mosquito, rolled cleaner, recovered without torque spin. The Messerschmitts followed. They banked to intercept, 2 above, 3 below. Langford pulled a split S, the rain-slick sky twisting around him. The Gemini held together. At 420 miles per hour, the twin thrust lines carved through the clouds like scissors through silk. One of the German fighters misjudged the maneuver, overbanked, and stalled. Langford caught a glimpse as it tumbled into vapor, a black spiral vanishing toward the channel. The rest broke formation, unsure what kind of aircraft they were chasing. Langford leveled, heart hammering. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be alive. The altimeter needle shook at 8,000 feet. He turned the aircraft home. The engines hummed perfectly out of sync, a paradox in motion. The sound of impossible balance. On the ground, officers would demand explanations, signatures, maybe court-martial papers. But right now, in the open sky over England, Arthur Langford had just proven a stupid idea could fly. 6:57 hours. RAF Boscombe Down. Airfield erupted in movement the moment the prototype's wheels kissed the wet tarmac. Mechanics shouted, officers sprinted across the apron, clipboard pages flapping in the rain. The Gemini rolled to a halt at the far end of the strip, engines still coughing steam like twin dragons. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford sat motionless for several seconds, gloved hands resting on the throttle levers. He could feel the vibration still echoing in his bones, not of failure, but of perfect equilibrium. The stupid twin prop worked. The airframe had flown clean at over 400 miles per hour without torque roll or spin instability. He'd seen it with his own eyes. A jeep screeched to a stop beside the aircraft. Out stepped squadron leader Colin Vance, his greatcoat plastered with rain. His voice cut through the downpour. "Langford, you disobeyed a direct order." Langford climbed down from the wing, boots splashing in puddles. "Yes, sir, but the test succeeded." Vance's jaw tightened. "Succeeded? You nearly got yourself shot down by your own side. The Germans reported unidentified contact over the channel. You gave away a classified design." Langford wiped oil from his hands, his tone calm, almost detached. If the design failed, there'd be nothing to report. Vance stared at him for a long moment, then softer. "You're an engineer, not a hero, Arthur. We're not in the business of miracles." Langford met his eyes. "Then maybe we should be." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned toward the hangar, dragging his flight bag behind him through the puddles. The rain masked the tremor in his hands. He knew what came next. Interrogation, grounding, perhaps suspension of clearance. But something deeper had shifted. Inside the engineering hangar, the smell of petrol and wet canvas hung thick in the air. Sheets of blueprints lined the walls, cross-sections of engines, thrust diagrams, torque equations. Langford had drawn half of them himself. He found Chief Technician Harris hunched over a drafting table, cigarette trembling between grease-stained fingers. Harris looked up, eyes wide. "You bloody lunatic, you actually did it." Langford didn't smile. He dropped his soaked flight log on the table. The pages were smeared with pencil and sweat. Counter-rotation balanced at 100% between prop shafts. No yaw instability, even in vertical dive. Harris exhaled smoke through his nose. "You understand what that means, don't you?" Langford nodded slowly. "It means every aircraft we've built for the last 5 years was half a compromise." He walked toward the twin engines, still mounted on their test stand, dripping rainwater from the short flight. He placed a hand on the cold cowling, feeling the vibration in the metal. "You can hear it, even when they're off," he murmured, "when the math stops fighting itself." Harris stubbed his cigarette. "They'll court-martial you, you know." "I know, but you'll change aviation first." That evening, under the hangar's dim lamps, Langford sat alone writing his after-action report. Each line was meticulous altitude, RPM, manifold pressure, vibration data, observed climb rate. He included everything except the moment of defiance, the part where he'd switched off the radio. Outside, the rain had stopped. The airfield lay quiet, wrapped in fog. Somewhere down the line, a generator hummed, the lonely heartbeat of a base, still pretending order could exist in a war built on chaos. He thought back to his father's workshop in Derbyshire, the smell of sawdust, the hum of the lathe, the old man saying, "If you can't balance the wheel, you don't deserve to turn it." Balance. That was all he had been trying to find. Between thrust and drag, between invention and obedience, between survival and meaning. When Vance returned near midnight, the hangar was dark except for the glow of one desk lamp. Langford was still there, blueprints spread out before him, a revised engine mount design scrawled with equations in pencil. Vance stood in the doorway for a long time. "I should have you removed from service," he said quietly. Langford didn't look up. "Yes, sir. But command, read your telemetry. They want to see a full demonstration." Langford turned, startled. "They're sending observers from de Havilland tomorrow," Vance continued. "If that damned contraption flies twice, it's going to production testing. Langford leaned back in his chair. For the first time that day, exhaustion showed. So I'm not grounded? Vance's lips twitched, not quite a smile. No, Langford. You're promoted to test lead. God help us all. Langford looked at the blueprint again, lines of graphite and courage. He had broken an order. Maybe even a law of physics. But for the first time in months, the war didn't feel like it was grinding him down. It felt like it was waiting for him to change it. He switched off the lamp. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the engines, even silent, seemed to hum in the dark. March 12th, 1943. Boscombe Down airfield was a different place by morning. The rain had cleared, leaving the ground glistening like black glass under the pale English Sunday. Trucks rolled across the runway, towing crates of tools and testing gear. A temporary observation stand had been erected along the perimeter, a wooden platform lined with officers in long coats, clipboards clutched against the wind. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford arrived early, uniform pressed, eyes hollow from a sleepless night. He had expected interrogation. Instead, he found an audience. Near the hangar doors, a group of civilians stood apart, engineers from de Havilland and the Air Ministry's research branch. Among them was Dr. Rolldod. Leonard Rowe, the same man who'd once rejected Langford's design on paper. Rowe was a mathematician turned bureaucrat, a man who trusted numbers more than pilots. He offered a curt nod. "Lieutenant, I've been told you flew without clearance." "Yes, sir." "And that it worked." "It did." Rowe's lips pressed thin. "Well, let's see if it still does when everyone's watching." Inside the hangar, the Gemini prototype waited. Mechanics had spent the night inspecting every joint and rivet, checking for stress fractures. The counter-rotating propellers gleamed under the floodlights like polished saw blades. Langford ran a hand along the engine, cowling smooth metal, cold and perfect. Chief Technician Harris handed him a clipboard. "They doubled the fuel load. You'll be heavier." Langford nodded. "I'll keep it below 4,000 feet. Don't make promises you can't keep." At 9 hours, the order came through. Proceed with test flight supervised conditions. Langford climbed into the cockpit. As the ground crew stepped back, a familiar stillness fell over the field. The twin engines coughed, then roared to life, their blades spinning in opposite harmony, clockwise and counterclockwise, a mechanical yin and yang. The sound was wrong in all the right ways. Smooth, balanced, alien. Even the veterans on the tarmac paused to listen. From the observation stand, Rowe adjusted his spectacles, scribbling on a pad. RPM differential holding steady. "No lateral drift," he muttered. Vance, standing beside him, kept his eyes on the sky. The Gemini rolled forward. Water sprayed from the tires. At 100 yards, it lifted cleanly, no yaw, no torque. Langford's voice crackled through the wireless. "Climbing through, 1,000, 2,000. Control surfaces stable." The test officer leaned into the mic. "Maintain level at 3,000, Lieutenant. Begin sustained turn at 180 degrees. Roger, commencing turn." The aircraft banked left. To the men on the ground, it looked effortless, the kind of precision flight only a balanced machine could achieve. Rowe blinked. "Impossible," he whispered. "The gyroscopic drift should have." "It didn't," Vance said, smiling for the first time. At 3,000 feet, Langford began the final test, a full throttle climb, both throttles forward. The Gemini responded instantly, the airspeed climbing past 360, then 380. He could feel the machine pulling, straining, yet stable. No torque roll, no asymmetry. He spoke into the mic, his voice steady despite the G-forces pressing his chest. "Reaching 4,000, 4 to 5. Engines nominal." Then the warning light blinked, oil pressure drop on the right engine. Langford's instincts flared. He throttled back slightly, checked the gauge pressure still falling, a ruptured line. If he cut the wrong flow, he'd seize the engine. If he didn't, the bearing would melt within minutes. On the ground, Rowe saw the telemetry spike. "He's losing pressure." Vance's voice snapped through the radio. "Langford, abort. Bring her down." Langford hesitated. "Negative. I can stabilize." "Lieutenant, that's an order." He switched the channel again. "Static. Silence. He pulled the mixture lever halfway, balancing the load between engines. The twin props adjusted pitch automatically, a feature Langford had insisted on in his blueprints, and which the ministry had considered unnecessary. The mechanism equalized torque, keeping the plane level even as one engine sputtered. It worked. The Gemini held course. Below, the officers stood frozen as the prototype made a slow, descending loop, smoke trailing thin from one nacelle. Langford eased the throttle down, feeling the strain vanish, the engines humming in reluctant cooperation. At 9:18 hours, the Gemini touched down rough but intact. Vance was the first to reach him. "You ignored another order." Langford removed his flight helmet, sweat streaking his face despite the cold. "Yes, sir. But I saved the engine." Rowe approached, clipboard trembling. "That pitch balancing mechanism, you said you added it yourself?" Langford nodded. "A field modification. The math works better in metal than on paper." Rowe stared at him for a long second, then scribbled something. "The ministry will want a briefing." As they turned to leave, Harris clapped Langford on the shoulder. "You're either going to change aviation or die trying." Langford gave a tired smile. "Maybe both." He looked back at the twin prop machine. Its aluminum skin reflected the morning light, like polished bone. It had survived another flight, another defiance, another moment where numbers and courage met halfway. Somewhere above the channel, 5 wrecked Messerschmitts still rested beneath the waves, mute witnesses to an idea the ministry had almost killed. Langford knew this was only the beginning. The war had no shortage of enemies, but few as stubborn as physics itself. March 15th, 1943. 3 days after the demonstration, the sky over southern England was clear for once, the kind of sharp blue cold that made every sound travel farther than it should. At Boscombe Down, the Gemini prototype sat stripped and silent inside Hangar 4, its twin engines half disassembled. Engineers in gray coveralls moved around it like surgeons after an autopsy. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford stood beside Dr. Leonard Rowe, now elevated to lead liaison from the Air Ministry's research department. Between them, on a trestle table, lay the flight data. Column after column of numbers, thrust curves, torque loads, vibration signatures, and at the bottom, a red-penciled annotation in Rowe's handwriting. "Operational viability confirmed." "You've proven the theory," Rowe said flatly. "Now the ministry wants to know whether it can kill Germans." Langford blinked. "Sir?" "The next phase isn't about flight balance anymore," Rowe continued. "It's about conversion. De Havilland's engineers believe the counter-rotation system could be adapted for a strike platform, perhaps a light twin fighter to intercept reconnaissance aircraft over the channel." Langford frowned. "That was never the intent. The Gemini is a test bed." Rowe smiled thinly. "Intentions don't win wars." By noon, Langford was in a briefing room with Squadron Leader Vance, 2 ordnance officers, and a young civilian from the Air Ministry's Weapons Development Board, Peter Armitage, 23, brilliant and entirely untouched by combat. On the chalkboard behind them were sketches: a streamlined fuselage, twin booms, a 4-gun nose array. Someone had scrawled Project Wyvern in block letters across the top. Armitage was talking fast. "If we mount the Merlin engines on counter-rotating spindles, we could double rate of climb. Add 4. 303 Brownings, maybe 2 Hispano 20 mils, and you have an aircraft that can engage at 400 miles per hour and still hold stability in a roll." Langford leaned forward. "It will tear itself apart. You'd be feeding recoil imbalance straight into the opposite prop line." Armitage's expression hardened. "You're thinking like an engineer, not a tactician." Vance cut in. "Enough. The Air Ministry wants feasibility, not philosophy." He turned to Langford. "You'll assist them whether you like it or not. Officially, you're now Chief Flight Consultant for Wyvern." Langford said nothing. He stared at the chalkboard at the crude drawing of a machine born from his disobedience. It was sleek, deadly, and completely out of his control. That evening in the hangar, Chief Technician Harris found him sitting on an oil drum, staring at the Gemini's stripped fuselage. "They're weaponizing your baby," Harris said quietly. Langford didn't look up. It was inevitable. They'll want live fire tests soon, probably over the coast. I know. He ran a finger along the riveted seam of the wing root. The metal was cool, smooth, unfeeling. I built her to prove a principle, he murmured. Now they'll build her to kill. Harris lit a cigarette. That's what principles are for in wartime. 2 days later, the first Wyvern prototype arrived from Hatfield. It was rough, unpainted aluminum, patches of primer showing where engineers had welded new mounts for the twin Merlins. The airframe looked muscular, predatory. Langford watched as mechanics towed it from the flatbed. It's heavier, he said. Armitage nodded proudly. 6 tons loaded. But it climbs like a hawk. You'll see. Langford ran his hand across the cowling, tracing the stenciled serial number, WX01. It felt like betrayal written in metal. When the engines were started that afternoon, the hangar shook. The counter-rotation whine was lower, deeper, more menacing than the Gemini's delicate balance. Langford stood a few meters away, eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. A faint harmonic shudder through the floor plates, almost imperceptible. But there, he shouted over the noise. Kill the port engine. The mechanic hesitated, then obeyed. The vibration stopped instantly. Langford turned to Rowe. There's imbalance in the spindle mount. If you fire the guns, that resonance will amplify. Rowe's tone was patient, patronizing. Our mathematicians have accounted for that. Your mathematicians don't sit in the cockpit when the bolts start shearing. Rowe's eyes cooled. You're emotional, Lieutenant. Perhaps you should take a few days' leave. Langford stared at him, jaw tight. Emotional engineers build safer machines than arrogant mathematicians. Rowe turned away, signaling to the technicians. Proceed with calibration. That night, Langford couldn't sleep. The base was quiet, except for the occasional rumble of distant training flights. He sat at his desk, sketching modifications in his notebook, damping brackets, reinforced couplings, a redesigned prop hub. He wrote until his pencil broke. At 2 hours, he walked back to the hangar. The Wyvern sat alone under the floodlights, gleaming like a creature out of some industrial nightmare. He placed his hand on the nose cone, whispering under his breath, "You'll shake yourself apart before you ever kill anything." From somewhere behind him came Vance's voice, low and tired. "You were warned, Arthur." Langford turned. His commander stood in the doorway, coat collar up against the wind. "Orders from London. The Wyvern goes to live fire testing in 48 hours. You're flying it." Langford froze. "It's not ready. Neither are any of us." For a long time, neither man spoke. Outside, the night wind rattled the corrugated walls. Langford finally said, "If this thing comes apart in the air, that's on you." Vance shook his head. "No, Arthur. It'll be on both of us." The floodlights flickered as the generator coughed. Shadows crawled across the gleaming fuselage, a machine half science, half sin. Somewhere deep inside, Langford felt the same mixture of fear and exhilaration that had driven him to defy orders before. Only this time, the consequence wouldn't be a reprimand. It would be fire and falling metal. He looked up at the twin propellers, their blades motionless and waiting. They looked almost like crosses against the hangar light silent memorials to a weapon that wasn't supposed to exist. March 17th, 1943. RAF West Hampnet Temporary Coastal Testing Field, 7 miles from Chichester. The day broke in pale light and sea mist. From the cliffs, one could hear the surf striking rock in steady rhythm, like a clock marking down the last moments before something inevitable. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford stood on the tarmac in full flight gear, parachute harness biting into his shoulders. In front of him, the Wyvern WX01 idled like an animal straining at the leash. The twin Merlins turned opposite directions, a metallic snarl rising and falling in uneasy harmony. A faint tremor ran through the concrete beneath his boots. He could feel it before he heard it, the same harmonic buzz that had haunted his sketches. Chief Technician Harris approached, helmet in one hand, oil stains dark on his sleeves. "She's loaded with 4 Brownings, 2 Hispanos. Live rounds." Langford nodded, eyes on the propellers. "Any adjustments to the spindle coupling?" Harris hesitated. "They didn't approve your redesign, said it would delay testing." Langford exhaled slowly. Of course they did. From the operations hut, Dr. Rowe and Squadron Leader Vance watched through binoculars. Rowe spoke without emotion. If he keeps it under 400 knots, the vibration should remain within tolerance. Vance replied, if. At 9:32 hours, Langford climbed into the cockpit. The canopy slid shut with a metallic click that sounded too final. He ran through the checklist by memory mixture, magnetos, trim, fuel pressure, and wrote 2 words in his flight log: for control. Throttle forward. The aircraft lunged ahead, wheels skimming water from last night's rain. At 110 miles per hour, the tail lifted. At 135, she was airborne. The twin props bit the air with perfect counter-rotation, pulling the machine upward as if by mathematical certainty. Langford felt the weight sink from his stomach and the sky open like a door. Radio crackled. Wyvern 1, this is Tower. Maintain heading 070. Climb to 5,000 and commence fire test run on dummy targets. He acknowledged with a click of the mic. Below, the channel spread out in misty silver. At 3,000 feet, he armed the guns. Switches snapped like tiny thunderclaps inside the cockpit. He lined up on the target a string of canvas floats, anchored off the coast, and squeezed the trigger. The first burst hit beautifully, 6 streams of tracer stitching the sea. But then he felt it a shudder through the spine of the aircraft. The counter-rotating spindles vibrated out of sync. The nose yawed right, then left. Instruments blurred. A thin line of smoke spun off the port engine, cowling. Wyvern 1, we see smoke aboard the run. Vance's voice broke through. Langford tightened his grip. Negative. I can stabilize. He cut throttle on the port engine by 10%, trimmed rudder left, and felt the vibration shift from chaos to rhythm. Not gone, but contained. He squeezed another burst. The tracers walked clean across the targets, 5 direct hits. Then the warning light flared again. Oil pressure 0. Langford killed the port engine and feathered the prop. Instantly, the aircraft lurched left, dropping altitude. He countered with opposite rudder and pushed the remaining engine to full power. The airframe groaned. Below him, the sea rose fast. Come on, girl, he whispered. Hold together. At 400 feet, the plane leveled. He could smell burnt oil through the vent. The temperature needle climbed past the red line. He began a slow turn back toward the coast, fighting drag and gravity with every ounce of instinct he owned. On the ground, the watcher saw a thin trail of black smoke curving home across the gray sky. Rowe lowered his binoculars. He won't make it, he murmured. Vance didn't look away. He will. At 9:48, the Wyvern skipped over the runway threshold, wheels touching down hard. The undercarriage bounced, then held. Langford taxied to a stop and shut the engine down. Silence fell so suddenly he could hear the cooling metal tick. He climbed out, legs shaking. Harris was there first, eyes wide. Port engine's gone. You should be dead. Langford managed a thin smile. She flies on one. That's enough. Rowe arrived moments later, face colorless. You defied orders again and nearly lost a prototype worth 200,000 pounds. Langford wiped his hands on his flight suit. But I proved your couplings can't handle recoil stress. You build them this way. You'll kill every pilot who flies one. Rowe snapped. That's not your concern. The Air Ministry will decide what risks are acceptable. Vance stepped between them. Enough. He's earned his say. He turned to Langford. Get some rest. We'll debrief at 1,800. Langford nodded, but his eyes never left the aircraft. Smoke still curled from the engine cowl in slow, lazy threads. He could already see the next revision forming in his mind, a braced hub, a split-load shaft, a way to make the impossible stable. Behind him, the sea wind rose, carrying the smell of salt and burned oil through the field. Somewhere out there, German fighters were still flying, and the ministry would demand a weapon to bring them down. If they wouldn't build it right, Langford would build it alone. He looked up at the sky, pale, endless, waiting, and whispered to no one. Next time, we get it perfect. March 22nd, 1943. 5 days after the failed live-fire test, the Wyvern sat dismantled inside Hangar 2, Engines removed, panels open like the ribs of some dissected creature. The scent of burnt oil and metal filings still clung to the air. Every technician who walked by lowered his voice, as if the wreck could still hear them. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford was nowhere near the hangar that morning. He was in a train compartment, headed north, summoned to London under sealed orders. The letter had arrived the previous evening, signed with 3 initials that carried more weight than any officer's rank: AMR Air Ministry Research. The train rattled through gray countryside, past leafless hedgerows and villages still scarred by blackout tape. Langford sat with his cap in his lap, the letter folded neatly inside his pocket. His hand still smelled faintly of engine grease. Outside, England rolled by like a wounded machine trying to remember how to work. At 10:15 a.m., he was escorted into the Air Ministry building on Kingsway. Polished marble floors, blackout curtains, the faint echo of typewriters in distant offices. A clerk led him down a corridor lined with portraits of First World War heroes, men in flight goggles and stiff collars, frozen in sepia valor. He thought of how few of them would have survived the modern sky. In room 214, 3 men waited around a long oak table. Langford recognized none of them. "Flight Lieutenant Langford," the eldest began, without introduction. "I'm Sir Reginald Clark, Director of Aeronautical Procurement. You've caused quite a stir." Langford stood at attention. "Sir, to be blunt," Clark continued, "your unauthorized modifications and test flights have violated every research protocol we maintain. And yet," he tapped a folder, "your aircraft achieved flight parameters our design bureaus have failed to meet in 2 years." A younger official, spectacles perched low on his nose, cut in. "The prototype nearly disintegrated, Sir Reginald. He's reckless." Clark ignored him. "Mr. Langford, we have a problem. The Luftwaffe's new twin-engine Zerstörer fighters have been outclimbing our interceptors. Intelligence indicates they'll begin high-altitude reconnaissance within a month. We require a platform that can climb faster than a Spitfire and still carry armament sufficient to engage. Your Gemini system might provide the basis." Langford hesitated. "With respect, sir, it's not ready for combat. The spindle harmonics will be someone else's concern," Clark interrupted. "You'll be transferred to the Special Projects Division at Farnborough, effective immediately. Your duty is to adapt the Gemini propulsion model into a functional combat aircraft. You will have a team, a workshop, and complete discretion." Langford frowned. "Complete discretion, sir?" Clark leaned forward. "Within reason, as long as you deliver results." 2 days later, at Farnborough, Langford found himself standing in a hangar twice the size of Boscombe's, its walls hung with blueprints of secret aircraft that didn't officially exist. Men in white coats moved silently between drafting tables. The place smelled of varnish, tobacco, and ambition. He was assigned a corner workspace, 2 benches, a lathe, a rack of untested prop assemblies. The engineers avoided eye contact at first. Word of the disobedient pilot engineer had arrived before he did. One man finally approached, tall, thin, in his mid-30s. "You're Langford, aren't you? The madman who made counter-rotation fly?" Langford looked up. "Depends who's asking. Gareth Holloway, materials specialist. I've read your test reports. You're lucky to be alive." Langford shrugged. "Luck's just good math under pressure." Holloway chuckled. "Good. You'll need both." Their first task: rebuild the counter-rotation system from scratch using lighter alloys. Langford wanted magnesium housings to reduce weight. Holloway warned they'd ignite under friction heat. Langford's answer was typical. "Then we'll design it, not to fail." For weeks, they worked through nights that bled into mornings. Metal clanged, sparks flew, and the air grew thick with the heat of industry. Langford sketched constantly new dampers, revised gear ratios, a venting system to equalize oil pressure under recoil. By mid-April, the prototype gearbox sat gleaming on its test stand, 2 shafts intertwined like DNA, turning opposite directions in perfect mechanical balance. When they powered it up for the first time, the entire bench shivered not from instability, but power. The whine rose to a clean, steady pitch. No vibration, no drift. Holloway grinned. "You've done it." Langford exhaled, leaning against the bench. "We have." Then, from behind them, a slow clap echoed through the hangar. They turned. Dr. Rowe was standing in the doorway, hat tucked under one arm. "I was reassigned as ministry liaison," he said evenly. "Congratulations, Langford. You've proven the system viable. Now we'll prove it lethal." Langford's expression hardened. "You mean weaponized?" Rowe smiled faintly. "Call it what you will. War doesn't reward elegance, only effectiveness." He stepped closer, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "Farnborough is preparing a full-scale prototype for field testing, the Wyvern Mark II. And this time, it will fly under orders." Langford stared at him, feeling the old mix of pride and dread knot in his chest. "And if it fails again?" Rowe's tone was soft. "Then it fails with official approval, which means no one will blame you this time." Langford said nothing. He looked at the spinning gear shafts, the sound of perfection made mechanical, and realized how close genius always stood to guilt. The machine was balanced now, but the men building it no longer were. May 6, 1943, RAF Farnborough. The new prototype stood under floodlights, like a steel predator waiting for release. Where the first Wyvern had looked experimental and fragile, the Mark II looked born for war. Longer fuselage, reinforced booms, twin Merlin 72nds set nose to nose behind the prop hubs that gleamed like polished razors. Someone in the drawing office had scrawled a line of chalk under the cockpit. "Balance is victory." Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford walked slow circuits around the airframe, tracing each panel seam with his gloved fingers. Every modification he designed at Farnborough was there: the split-load gearbox, the dampened couplings, the magnesium alloy engine braces that Holloway had insisted would melt if abused. It was, on paper, perfect, and that terrified him. Dr. Rowe arrived with two Air Ministry officials, both wearing trench coats despite the warm day. One carried a clipboard, the other a stopwatch. Rowe's smile was polite. "You'll be pleased, Arthur. The Mark II incorporates every improvement you recommended." Langford kept his voice even. "Except the gun mounts I said would overstress the wing spars. Those remain. Procurement has already approved the weight tolerance." They approved it," Langford said quietly, "because they don't have to fly it." Rowe ignored the jab. "Today's objective is a sustained fire and climb test. If successful, production orders will begin within 6 months." Langford looked at him. "Then let's not die in the prototype." By 7:40 hours, the airfield buzzed with controlled chaos. Mechanics checked torque readings. Holloway supervised the fueling, jaw tight as he watched the volatile magnesium components heat under the morning Sunday. Langford suited up. His hands were steady now, the calm before a duel he'd already fought in his mind 100 times. Vance appeared beside the ladder, now promoted to acting group captain. "Orders are simple, Arthur. Take her up, fire 3 controlled bursts, and bring her back in one piece." Langford grinned faintly. "And if she doesn't come back in one piece? Then you'll be a cautionary paragraph in every engineering textbook for the next 50 years. He climbed into the cockpit. The seat still smelled of factory paint. When the twin engines caught, the vibration was deep, harmonious, the clean hum of symmetry achieved. Langford keyed the radio. "Wyvern 2 ready for taxi." The tower cleared him. As the plane rolled down the runway, dust billowed behind the twin tails like smoke from a dragon's nostrils. At 9:02 hours, he lifted off. The climb was brutal, full throttle, both propellers counter-spinning at 2,800 revolutions per minute. The acceleration pressed him into the seat. The altimeter wound upward in a blur. 3,000, 4, 6,000 feet, he murmured into the recorder. No vibration detected, gearbox temperature nominal. Below, in the control van, Holloway watched the gauges and whispered, "Come on, you beautiful monster." At 8,000 feet, Langford leveled out and armed the weapons. 6 guns, 2 cannons. He lined up on the test range painted across a derelict section of heathland. Firing burst 1. He squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Hispanos shook the air. Bright flashes strobed across the nose. Tracers tore downward into the target mounds. For 3 glorious seconds, everything held together. Then came the tremor. A thin, harmonic vibration crept through the control column. subtle but real. Langford's heartbeat quickened. He eased off the trigger, monitoring gauges. Oil pressure steady, torque oscillation rising. He keyed the mic. Minor vibration detected at sustained fire. Rowe's voice crackled back from the ground. Continue. Record data. Langford's yaw tightened. Copy. He fired again. The vibration deepened, a bass resonance building under his feet. Then a sharp metallic bang reverberated through the fuselage. The starboard propeller flashed once in sunlight, then a fist-sized fragment tore free and vanished into the sky. Prop blade separation, he shouted. The aircraft lurched sideways, nose pitching violently. He cut both engines. The props windmilled in opposite fury, drag threatening to flip the plane. On the ground, Rowe turned pale. He's losing a prop. Get the emergency crews. Langford fought the controls, one hand on the stick, one on the trim. The gyroscopic forces wrestled the airframe like a living thing. The vibration turned into a howl. He could feel the bolts shearing, one by one. At 5,000 feet, he made a decision. He shoved both throttles forward again. The sudden torque surge forced the aircraft upright, trading altitude for control. He eased the flaps down, coaxing the crippled Wyvern into a glide. The ground came up fast hangars, runways, people scattering like ants. Impact came not as an explosion, but as a shattering crunch. The gear collapsed, wings buckled, engines tore loose. The Wyvern skidded 300 yards down the runway, trailing smoke and fire. When it stopped, Langford was still alive, bruised, bleeding, but conscious. He crawled out onto the wing, coughing through smoke, and looked back at the wreck, his second forbidden miracle, broken in half. Vance reached him first. "You insane bastard, you brought it down." Langford coughed, grinning weakly. "Didn't build her to fall apart in the sky." Rowe pushed past medics, face white. "You destroyed a $250,000 prototype." Langford stared at him through soot-streaked goggles. "No, doctor. I just saved you from building 500 more of them." Rowe opened his mouth, closed it again, then turned away. That evening, Langford sat in the infirmary, arm in a sling, ribs bandaged. Holloway sat beside the bed, reading telemetry reports. "Gearbox held," Holloway said softly. "The failure started in the wing spar. You were right. Recoil harmonics exceeded tolerance by 30%. Langford smiled faintly. "Numbers don't lie, Gareth. People just stop listening." Outside, the burned shell of the Wyvern Mark II cooled under the setting sun, metal hissing softly as it met the night air. Somewhere down the corridor, he heard Vance's voice speaking to the ministry men. "We'll rebuild it lighter, stronger, safer. Langford stays on." Rowe's reply was low, bitter. "He's a liability." Vance said, "He's the only reason we still have an engineer and an aircraft to rebuild." Langford closed his eyes. For the first time since the Gemini, he felt the faint tremor of hope, fragile, mechanical, alive. The war would take his machines, maybe even his life, but not his balance. June 2nd, 1943. RAF Farnborough, Engineering Wing. The smell of scorched aluminum still haunted the hangars. What was left of the Wyvern Mark II had been dragged inside weeks ago, its nose cone twisted, one prop blade bent like a blackened leaf. Technicians moved around it in silence. To most, it was a failure. To Arthur Langford, it was data. He arrived before sunrise every day, still wearing his sling, though he barely used it anymore. Each morning, he touched the broken prop hub before heading to the drafting table. It was ritual, the engineer's version of a prayer. His new assistant, Gareth Holloway, found him that morning surrounded by open notebooks, half-finished sketches, and a cold mug of tea. "You haven't slept again," Holloway said. Langford didn't look up. Sleep doesn't solve resonance. On the drawing board lay a cross-section of the new gearbox. Lines of graphite and grease formed the skeleton of an idea that had refused to die, a triple-bearing drive spindle that distributed recoil through 3 pivot points instead of 1. A solution simple enough to seem absurd, the kind of idea that made bureaucrats nervous. Rowe's voice echoed from the hangar entrance. "I heard you're building another death trap." Langford exhaled. Only if the ministry keeps signing off on their own mistakes. Rose stepped closer, inspecting the plans. The board wants a report. They'll decide whether the Wyvern Mark III gets funding. Langford smirked. Let them decide. The math is already written. By late June, the Mark III began to take shape. Unlike its predecessors, it was forged not just from aluminum, but from lessons written in blood and wreckage. Langford insisted on a new alloy mixture. Holloway's experimental blend of duralumin and magnesium stabilized with copper weave. He called it forgiveness metal. During assembly, technicians noticed the difference immediately. The panels flexed instead of cracking under stress. The new gearbox turned with a whisper instead of a growl. Langford ran his hand along the rotating shafts and said softly, "That's what balance should sound like nothing." Testing began inside a reinforced cell engines chained, instruments recording every vibration. As the counter-rotating Merlins reached full power, the sound filled the hangar a deep, pulsing heartbeat that resonated through every chest. "Vibration reading?" Langford asked. Holloway grinned. "Half of baseline. You've done it." Langford corrected him gently. "We've done it." Rowe entered just as the engines wound down. He looked at the telemetry printouts, frowning. Reducing stress isn't enough. Command wants range, altitude, endurance. They want a miracle they can mass produce. Langford handed him a spanner. "Then, tell them miracles need mechanics." That night, thunder rolled over the Hampshire fields. Langford stayed behind, staring at the prototype's shadow under the work lamps. He spoke to it the way some men spoke to God. "They'll send you to die over France," he whispered. "But if you hold together, maybe you'll bring a few of them home." He heard footsteps. It was Vance, still in uniform despite his transfer orders to Coastal Command. "Arthur," Vance said quietly, "I got your report. The Mark III looks sound." Langford nodded. "It should. I stopped listening to London." Vance laughed softly. "Good, because they're sending you to London. Tomorrow. Full demonstration before the Air Council." Langford froze. "I'm not ready for parades." "It's not a parade. It's politics. Rowe's been telling them you're dangerous. They need to see otherwise. And if they don't," Vance's voice hardened, "then they'll bury the project and reassign you to maintenance duty in Yorkshire." Langford stared at the prototype through the rain-streaked window. He could hear the distant growl of training flights taking off into the storm. "Then I'd better make sure they see the truth," he said finally. "The machine flies, or I fall with it." June 5th, 1943. London, RAF Northolt. A single runway slick with morning rain. Rows of officers under umbrellas watched as the transport truck rolled up with its cargo, the Wyvern Mark III, gleaming silver beneath the tarp. It looked impossibly alive, its twin props catching the gray light like mirrored blades. Langford stood beside it, exhausted but calm. The council members approached men in wool coats, metals bright, expressions colder than the rain. Sir Reginald Clark stepped forward. "This is your final chance, Flight Lieutenant. If this aircraft flies clean, the ministry approves production. If not," he let the pause linger, "your experiment ends here." Langford saluted. "Yes, sir. Then let's end it in the air, not on paper." He climbed into the cockpit. Engines roared. The rain hissed off the wings as the prop spun to life. From the control tower, Holloway and Vance stood shoulder to shoulder, silent. Rowe, behind them, muttered, "If it fails, I'll make sure he never works again." Vance didn't look away from the runway. "If it fails, none of us will need to." Langford released the brakes. The Wyvern Mark III surged forward, leaving twin rooster tails of spray behind. At 130 miles per hour, the wheels left the ground. She climbed, smooth and silent, vanishing into low clouds. In the tower, every head craned upward. The radio hissed, then Langford's voice came through. Steady, alive. "Wyvern 3 to tower, altitude 5,000. Engines stable, no vibration. She's flying clean." A long silence, then cheers. Vance grinned. Holloway clapped his shoulder. Rowe said nothing. High above London, Langford leveled the aircraft and looked down at the gray sprawl of the city. Factories, cranes, rivers, the machinery of war. He spoke softly into the recorder. Balance achieved, the rest is purpose. And with that, he banked east toward the dawn, a silver machine slicing through the rainproof that Defiance could fly. August 17th, 1943, 2 months after London. The first operational squadron of Wyvern Mark III's 5 aircraft, 3 spares, stood on the edge of a dusty French airstrip carved from farmland outside Bayeux. The invasion front had moved inland. Normandy was a furnace of mud and smoke, and the Air Ministry's miracle machine was finally about to meet the war it had been built for. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford, now officially reinstated as Squadron Technical Officer, walked the line of aircraft in near silence. Each bore the same emblem on its nose, a twin spiral symbol, painted in white on black metal. Pilots called it the Devil's Eyes. Langford just called it proof of concept. Holloway approached, goggles on his head, hands stained with graphite. Final torque check on all countershafts complete. No harmonic surge beyond 0.1%. Langford smiled faintly. Then they'll have to kill us the old-fashioned way. In the distance, artillery thundered. The Luftwaffe had begun flying dawn, reconnaissance missions again. High, fast, almost untouchable. The Wyverns were designed to end that. At 5:42 hours, they launched. 5 aircraft, engines singing in counter-rotating harmony. Langford rode shotgun in the lead plane's rear compartment, not as a pilot, but as an observer. The pilot was Captain David Sloan, a lean American exchange officer who had volunteered to see what British madness feels like at 400 miles per hour. They climbed through low fog into clear light. The channel glimmered beneath them, ships like ants moving toward occupied France. Langford checked his instruments. Gearbox temperature normal. Vibration almost 0. "She's steady," he said. Sloan grinned. "Then let's see if she can hunt." Radar intercept directed them east toward a German formation, 2 Ju-88 reconnaissance bombers, escorted by Bf 109 seconds. The Wyverns spread into combat wedge. For a moment, the sky looked peaceful. Then Sloan pushed the throttle, and peace broke apart. Langford felt the G-forces press him against his seat as the aircraft dived. The twin props tore through the air with a banshee wail. The Ju-88 seconds banked away, their escorts turning to intercept. 2 bandits, 11 o'clock low, came the call over radio. Sloan's tone was steady. "Let's see if the mathematician's toy can fight." They opened fire. The Wyvern's 6 guns lit up like a storm. The recoil thrummed through the airframe, but the triple-bearing system held. Tracers ripped across the lead Ju-88's fuselage. Flames blossomed from its starboard engine. "Splash one," Langford shouted. Then the Wyvern shuddered violently. A cannon round struck near the wing root. Warning lights flared red. "Hydraulics hit," Sloan barked. "We've got maybe 3 minutes before she locks up." Langford scanned the gauges. Gearbox still stable, counter-torque compensating. "Keep her level." 2 Bf 109 seconds swept across their path, sunlight flashing from their canopies. Sloan rolled inverted, fired again, and 1 German disintegrated in midair. The other broke away. The radio erupted with overlapping voices. Wyvern 2 hit bailing out. Wyvern 4, engines failing, turning home. Within minutes, the formation was gone. 3 crippled, 1 burning, 1 left in the fight. Langford and Sloan were alone over enemy lines, flying a prototype whose future hung on its survival. At 10,000 feet, smoke began leaking into the cockpit. Sloan swore under his breath. "We'll never make it back to the coast." Langford's mind raced. "Cut the starboard engine. Counterbalance manually on port. I can adjust spindle drag from here." Sloan gave him a look. "That'll tear the gear teeth." Langford grinned tightly. "Then let's make them earn their medal." He reached down to the maintenance panel, releasing hydraulic locks that no pilot was ever meant to touch in flight. The vibration surged, then stabilized barely. The aircraft responded sluggishly, but obeyed. "Range to the coast, 28 miles, Sloan said. "Plenty of time for regret," Langford replied. Below them, tracer fire climbed like glowing threads. They were crossing German anti-air zones. One burst rocked the fuselage. A second shattered the canopy glass. Langford ducked as shards slashed his cheek. "We're hit again," Sloane shouted. Langford glanced at the gauges. "Hold her steady. 10 more miles. 10 more, and we'll be over water. Then she can die where she was born, in the air." Minutes later, they broke through the coastal haze. White cliffs ahead, England. Smoke trailed behind like a black banner of defiance. The engines coughed, choking on their own heat. In the radio crackle, Holloway's voice came through from Dover Control. "Wyvern 1, we have you on scope. You're trailing. Fire. Repeat. Fire." Sloane laughed hoarsely. "Tell him we noticed." Langford took the mic. "This is Langford. Gearbox stable, control compromised. Landing gear non-functional. We'll try a belly landing." They descended through smoke and sunlight. The airfield below was a blur of motion trucks clearing, medics running. At 150 feet, the right engine seized completely. The prop froze mid-rotation. Sloane shouted, "Brace!" The Wyvern hit earth in a shower of sparks. Metal screamed. One wing tore free. The fuselage slid, skidded, spun, and finally came to rest nose, first in a dirt embankment. For a moment, there was silence, only the hiss of steam. Then Langford coughed, alive again. Sloane, bloodied but conscious, looked at him through cracked goggles. "Remind me," he gasped, "why we don't build simpler planes." Langford grinned weakly. "Because simple never wins." By dusk, engineers had swarmed the wreck. Rowe arrived from London by jeep, pale and furious. "You destroyed another prototype," he shouted. Langford, bandaged and limping, turned to face him and proved it could survive direct fire, engine failure, and 50 miles of combat. "The Wyvern isn't perfect, but she's alive." Vance stepped in behind Rowe. "He's right. Command's already seen the results. They're calling it the most survivable twin-engine design we've fielded." Rowe's face hardened. "At what cost?" Langford met his eyes. "At the only cost war ever takes everything." The storm clouds over Dover darkened as thunder rolled inland. The wrecked aircraft sat in the field, battered but whole enough to rebuild. Langford placed a hand on its scorched hull and whispered, "You did your part, old girl." For the first time in years, he felt something dangerously close to peace. The war would go on. So would he. October 1944. RAF Tangmere. The war had changed. Normandy was behind them now, France liberated, and Allied squadrons were pushing deep into Germany. The Wyvern, once dismissed as an eccentric engineer's folly, had quietly become a frontline escort and reconnaissance platform. There were only 6 flying, all hand-built, all temperamental. But when they worked, they were unlike anything else in the sky. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Langford watched one take off from the runway below, its counter-rotating props carving the air into twin spirals of mist. The sound still made his chest tighten, a sound he had first heard in a hangar when everyone said it was impossible. He wasn't cleared to fly anymore. The injuries from Dover had left him with a damaged shoulder and hearing loss in one ear. But he still came to every test. He still kept his hands dirty. "Still can't let them go, can you?" The voice came from behind him. Captain David Sloane, now fully recovered, stood with a coffee mug in hand. Langford smiled faintly. "If I stop listening to them, I might start listening to London again." Sloane chuckled. "They're sending us to escort bombers over the Rhine next week. Headquarters says the Wyvern's faster than the Mosquito now. Then it'll probably break in half trying to prove it," Langford muttered. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the silver aircraft rise into cloud. It looked weightless, untouchable, a ghost that defied logic and gravity alike. That afternoon, Langford was summoned to the operations hut. Inside waited Group Captain Vance, older, grayer, but still with that same calm steel in his eyes. Beside him stood Dr. Rowe, crisp uniform immaculate as ever. The two men hadn't shared a room since the Dover crash. Vance gestured to a chair. "Arthur, sit down." Langford did, sensing the weight in the air. Rowe spoke first. Intelligence confirms a new Luftwaffe reconnaissance unit operating near Kassel. They're mapping our bridgeheads ahead of a counterattack. We need them gone. Vance folded his hands. We're sending a Wyvern pair to intercept. Range is beyond standard fuel capacity. We need someone to oversee modifications for the long haul. We need you in the air again. Langford's jaw tightened. My flight clearance was revoked. Vance nodded. I've reinstated it, temporarily. You'll fly as technical officer only. Rowe added, almost softly. Your aircraft will carry the new counterbalance system. This is your design's final trial. If it fails, production ends. Langford looked between them. And if it succeeds? Rowe's eyes were cold. Then perhaps you'll finally get the recognition you've been chasing. Langford gave a thin smile. Recognition's overrated. Survival will do. October 19th, 1944. 10 hours. The morning fog lay thick over the field. Langford climbed into Wyvern, a 21, the only prototype fitted with his complete triple balance system. Sloan was at the controls again. Back in the old seats, he said, grinning. Langford strapped in, checking the panels. Let's make this one boring for once. They took off into cloud, climbing east. Below them, Europe smoldered a mosaic of smoke and ruin. At 22,000 feet, they found their prey. Two Do-217 reconnaissance bombers, escorted by a single Messerschmitt 410. Sloan banked left. Targets in sight. Langford's voice was calm. Engage at 500 yards. Don't chase. The Wyvern dived. Its guns spat fire, tracers slicing through the sky. The lead Dornier erupted in flame. The second tried to turn, too late. One wing folded, and it vanished into cloud. The escorting Me-410 swung around behind them, cannons flashing. A burst struck their tail. Warning lights flared. Hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. Sloan cursed. We've lost flaps. Langford scanned the gauges. Counter-rotation compensators still holding. Keep her level. The Me-410 came around again. Sloan rolled inverted and dived hard. Langford braced against the controls as G-forces crushed his chest. The German overshot, firing wild. Now! Langford shouted. Sloan pulled up, squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannons roared. The Me-410 disintegrated in midair, scattering flaming fragments across the clouds. Silence. They leveled out. Both men exhaled. Damage report? Sloan asked. Langford glanced at the gauges. Port engine hit but stable. Gearbox temperature holding. She's hurting, but she'll fly. Sloan grinned. Just like her maker. They crossed the channel an hour later, battered but intact. When the wheels touched the Tangmere runway, the entire engineering crew was waiting. The counterbalance system had held. No vibration, no resonance. The impossible machine had finally found perfection. Rowe approached, his face unreadable. Congratulations, Langford. You've done what a dozen government engineers couldn't. Langford shook his head. We did what the war forced us to. Vance clapped him on the shoulder, and saved more pilots than you'll ever know. But Langford only looked toward the runway, where the Wyvern still sat steaming in the morning light. The smell of oil and gunpowder filled the air. She's not mine anymore, he said quietly. She belongs to history now. Epilogue. Arthur Langford survived the war, but never built another aircraft. After 1945, the ministry quietly shelved the Wyvern project. Jet engines made its miracle obsolete overnight. The remaining prototypes were scrapped, their alloys melted into civilian metalwork. Langford returned to Hampshire and opened a small workshop, repairing farm machinery. He lived simply, avoiding newspapers. Those who knew him said he kept a single propeller blade mounted over his desk, scorched, warped, and engraved with 2 words in neat handwriting: balance endures. When he died in 1968, his wartime notebook was found in a drawer. The final page contained no formulas, no diagrams, just a single line. We built something that shouldn't have flown and made it soar. That was the paradox that defined his life. The forbidden idea that outflew every order, every doctrine, every war.